Come back in a month.
Oh, really? And somebody
It'll be
has
a
the
little hot.
really comfy chair there. I'm a little jealous of that super comfy chair. So yeah, why did I move to fiction from nonfiction? When I wrote my nonfiction book, which I wrote during the pandemic, the time to write was a little bit different, obviously, in that area when we were all under lockdown. And when I finished it, I thought, oh, this writing thing is actually kind of interesting, and I like doing it. And I thought, if I don't start another book now, I'll just say that I never have time to write it, because I think that's actually the biggest impediment to writing a lot of books, is just finding the time to be able to do it. And I think I moved to fiction because it was a good professional challenge. I thought, okay, I've written a nonfiction book. It was kind of a lazy person's way to get into writing books, because I had a background in journalism and writing for magazines, and it was a similar kind of idea. And so I thought, all right, this is going to be a little harder, and it is. And I would write something different, and I just love this genre. I think there was no question for me when I was going to write fiction that I would write a kind of classic golden age style murder mystery and set it in Iceland, my adopted home.
I loved it. Will you give us sort of the highlights, a brief synopsis of Death on the Island?
Yes, sure. So it's set in Iceland, in islands called the Westman Islands, which is a small archipelago off the south coast of Iceland. Has anyone here been to Iceland before? Okay, excellent. So you can...
You will when you read the book.
Yeah, right? So it's a small archipelago just off the mainland of Iceland, and it centers around the Canadian ambassador to Iceland. I grew up in Canada, so there was this connection, is on an official visit to this part of the country to open an art exhibition, to work at setting up increased business ties with the countries. And they have a full day, full program of events that they're looking at, and they meet the locals, and there's a fancy dinner at the end, and the deputy ambassador dies after drinking a cocktail. And that happens right at the beginning, so I'm not ruining it. And I hope that there's, it's kind of this closed room, so that basically it's, you'll figure, you might have a chance to figure it out, although I hope you don't figure it out, from the people who are there at this dinner.
Yes, 9 people, and I was sure I had nailed it, and then I didn't. So
excellent.
So there are a couple of sayings that I've heard in the publishing world, which is write what you know and write what you love. Some people follow it, some people don't.
So we go into murder mystery writing?
Well, in your case, because of your background and the geography, is that sort of what you did?
I mean, yes, aside from the whole crime dimension of it, I guess. But no, exactly. And I think that it just makes it simpler. So those two facets, as you said, are Iceland, a country where I've lived for over 20 years, but also came to and moved to as an adult. And so I see the country maybe a little bit differently than people who are born and raised there, which hopefully allows me to bring out some of the things that I think are interesting to readers from abroad. And I hope that I made the Westman Islands really almost like a character in the book and brought out the history and the atmosphere. And then the second aspect is the whole diplomatic public service aspect. And in a sense, it's almost like an homage to diplomats, because when I served as First Lady, I had the pleasure of interacting a lot with these public servants. And I love this concept that these are people who upend their own lives on a regular basis every few years to move to a different country to really promote the friendships between two nations. And I love the idea of that. And I think it's a lot more nuanced than we have. And I think, to be honest, in this day and age, we need a lot more person-to-person communication. And we see that the value of these interactions is important. And when it comes to a murder mystery, it's great because there's all these dynamics of I'm here for this one reason, but really I'm here for that reason. And I think I'm doing this, but really I'm here for that. And I thought that was something fun to play with in the context of a crime novel.
So let's quickly, for those who are unfamiliar with what a diplomat is supposed to do and be, because the book actually in the UK, the title is
Death of a Diplomat. Yeah.
And not here. So
yes.
I don't want to guess, but maybe you can explain why
so
the difference.
So a diplomat would be the official representative of the head of state. The head of state sends a personal representative to another country to promote that person's country's interests, and that's been happening for centuries, right? And most of those people, and in most countries, that's a career job. So you join a foreign service at whatever point in your life. If you're interested maybe in international relations or in increasing cooperation between countries, and you kind of work your way up the ladder. And serving as a diplomat can involve anything from dealing with a lost passport, dealing with problems of your own citizens in that country. If somebody dies, for example, you lose your passport, any kind of crimes that are committed. But really, it's also promoting the country's interests, whether that is increasing ties to do with business, increasing cultural ties, promoting your own country's culture in this other country. And also immigration issues is often another big sort of area. So it's just a facet that I wanted to explore. I think the U.S. is an outlier in the sense that many American diplomats are politically appointed. So they have a larger. More than half, I believe, of American ambassadors abroad have been appointed by a president in a certain administration, whereas that's usually a very small percentage amongst other countries.
Not to get political, but I've noticed administrations on both sides, there are large donors that tend to become ambassadors to some really great places.
Yeah, that's a uniquely American thing, I would say.
USA. Okay. So your main character is Jane, and she is the wife of the Canadian ambassador to Iceland. Mm-hmm. You've said that you wrote the first draft where Jane was actually the least developed character.
Yeah.
Why?
So again, you write what you know a little bit. And at first, when I was thinking of an idea, I thought I would explore this idea of being underestimated as the spouse, because I had this wonderful honor and privilege of serving as First Lady when my husband was president. And how he ended up president is a very long story, but in a nutshell, he had never run for public office before, and it happened in a span of about 6 weeks. So it was a heavy learning curve, I would say. And when that happened, all of a sudden, I became nationally known in the country as someone's wife. And as much as I'm very proud to be my husband's wife, I wouldn't say it's my defining characteristic as a human being, you know. So I wanted to explore this idea, and I've been in rooms when I've been there with my husband where people just completely ignore me because they just want to talk to him, or they only think that you can talk about certain things and that you're not maybe interested. Or I would get briefing, my husband would get long briefings before he'd go on trips, and I would get nothing, as if I weren't going to be talking with exactly the same people. So I wanted to play on that sort of underestimation sometime of how if you kind of lay under the wire. And so I wrote this character, Jane, and as you said, I did the first draft. I developed these characters. I sent it in, and my agent, this is before I sold it, said, "Oh, it sounds interesting, but your main character, Jane, isn't all that developed. She's a bit two-dimensional." And I realized that because it was based on this idea of being underestimated, I was so worried that people would think that it was me, that I was writing some sort of loosely hidden version of me, that I didn't want to give her any real personality, because I thought, if she's got this problem, then people are going to think I've got that problem. And if she's got this challenge, people are going to think I've got this challenge. And then I just had to kind of get over that, because she was right. It wasn't an interesting enough character. And I thought, you know what? I know that it's not me. So I'm just going to lean into this and try to make her a more multifaceted character. And, she's quite... I think she meant well. I actually wrote a whole background on her that didn't go in the book, just to envisage in my mind, what's her motivation, what's she happy with, what's she unhappy with. And my sense was that, she's married this man very young. She's followed him all around the world as he does this job, and she's never really done anything that she wanted to do. And she's kind of sick of all this, what she considers like a two-facedness of it. I loved these diplomatic dinners when we would go and we'd meet different people and we'd talk about it. We'd learn about the community. So I thought that was great. But this character is quite frustrated. She's sort of ticked off about all the protocol that's happening, and you have to do this speech, and she thinks that that's boring, and she wants to push against it. And then when the deputy ambassador dies, she has this opportunity to have an input in figuring out what's happened. And a little bit to play on the fact that she's not noticed so much, and she really likes that, and it gives her a bit of a sense of belonging, and yet she's flawed in how she goes about doing that.
You've obviously had lots of experience with, high-level dignitaries, like meetings and dinners and things like that. So are any of the people in Death on the Island who are at this deadly dinner, do any of them resemble any people
Well,
that
I
you
couldn't
actually?
possibly comment on that. No. Um, Genuinely no, but very occasionally you'll take maybe the mannerism of something or the look of somebody else and combine them. I think it's actually, I would recommend to anybody who wants to write, what's really helpful if you've ever had a bad day or you meet someone you particularly dislike, I would think, they're going to go in my novel. I'm going to put them in and they'll either get killed or they'll be the bad guy. But of course I've never done that. So no is the answer, but you pick and choose little things. And I did accidentally. There's a character. I chose Icelandic names for the characters that were pretty, I hope, easy for the English-speaking reader, because the Icelandic language has some names that are quite special, as we would say. So I tried to choose fairly straightforward names, and there's one character called Thor in the book who runs this large fishing company on the Western Islands. Fishing is obviously the biggest industry there. And his name is Thor Magnusson, which is a very kind of straightforward Icelandic name. He's quite tall and charming and runs this big industry and is not a very nice man. Anyway, I completely forgot that in Iceland there was a real man who is tall and charming and from the Westman Islands and works in fisheries called Thor Sigfusson, and which is very similar. And then I completely wasn't thinking about it. And then I saw him at an event once and I said, I just want you to know when this book comes out, there's this character and he's not you.
So your book is newly published. So have you been able to get much feedback from anyone yet from Iceland?
Well, it came out in Icelandic translation. I wrote it in English. It came out in Icelandic translation in late March, actually. They got a bit of a sneak peek, and it's done really well. It was the best-selling book in April in Iceland. Thank you. So it's been getting a good reception, which of course is really important to me. It's that, writing a book, I feel like I've put on a bikini and I'm standing there going, okay, everybody, what do you think?
Oh my God, that is a great way to describe it.
It's kind of nerve-wracking, right? And then I wrote another book. I put another bikini in. So, and of course the people in Iceland, the people especially on the Westman Islands, who I'm very fond of, and I'm very fond of this location, I really hope that they like it. And it seems so far so good. And I'll be going there at the beginning of June. I'm going to sort of do a little bit of a tour around some of the locations that are mentioned in the book.
So let's talk a little bit about the location. There's a part in this book, page 42 to 43, I remember, because I looked it up again before we came, where you discuss the history of the island is discussed through an exhibit at the museum. And your main character, Jane, seems to be more affected by that than the other characters. And I think there was a reference to Icelandic storytelling. Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and that exhibit that you're talking about, it's colloquially known as the Turkish Raid, although there was nothing to do with Turkey at all. It was just some stereotype that they had, and that is an actual exhibit at an actual museum in the Western Islands. It's based on a story from the 17th century when pirates came to the island. I mean, it's a horrible story, and they murdered many people. And they kidnapped many women and brought them to northern Algeria, where they were for many years. And in the decades later, the King of Denmark, which was ruling Iceland, actually paid a ransom for these women. And some of them returned to Iceland after about 25 years, which is an incredible story. And some of them didn't want to return after that time. It kind of built a life in northern Algeria. But it really strikes her also because there's a tableau that tells this story at the museum, and it struck me. I remember when I first saw it because it's painted almost like a children's illustration, but when you look closer, it's illustrating all the violence and the horror of this day. And it's not varnished at all. I mean, you see painting, but it's drawn almost like a kid's illustration. But it's telling this horrible story, and that to me also illustrated a little bit this sort of Icelandic. The climate in Iceland is harsh, and people have lived on the island for over 1,000 years, and there weren't a lot of natural foods. It was poverty stricken until really after the Second World War, very remote at the time, and you had to be a really tough personality to survive there. And I think that some of that extends in terms of this bluntness in the storytelling, but also the storytelling tradition, which I could talk for ages just on that. But there's a rich and long storytelling tradition in Iceland that everybody is very justifiably proud of. It has one of the highest book publishing, book reading, book buying rates in the world, and lots of traditions surrounding the written word. And of course, wrote all the sagas, which have inspired literature to this day.
So I heard or read, tell me if this is correct, if you know, 1 in 10 people in Iceland are published authors.
It's a little bit of an urban legend. I think it's more accurate to say 1 in 10 people has published something. So it could be like a letter to the editor, or, but it's certainly accurate to say that a lot of people write and that it's very well respected. We were just talking. Before I was talking with Patrick about another one of our well-known crime fiction authors, because we have a lot of those in Iceland, Ragnar Jónasson. He co-wrote a book a couple of years ago called Reykjavik with our prime minister at the time, Katrín Jakobsdóttir. And, I thought there's not many countries when you're the sitting prime minister and you also write a crime fiction book and everybody thinks there was no criticism of like, well, isn't she busy running the country? Or, but, people thought this was great that she also did that, and it got great reviews and everything. So I think that shows you that it's very well respected.
On the island, there's a storm, so people are trapped in the book. Is that real? Could you really be trapped there?
Oh yeah. I wouldn't be worried about death, but so these islands are reached most traditionally on a ferry, which is about a 45-minute ferry ride, but it depends, and you have to drive from the capital Reykjavik. You have to drive almost 2 hours to get to the ferry stop, and then it's 45 minutes, and the ferry goes 5 to 6 times a day. But if the tides are higher, if there's too many winds and the seas are too rough, then you have to take another ferry ride to a different harbor, which is closer to Reykjavik, but is 3 hours. So that's 3 hours because the seas are rough, so it's not pleasant. And then you can also, there's occasional flights. I'm not sure if they're once a day maybe, or every second day, and that's just a very short flight. But, when the weather is bad, if it's too windy or snowy or whatever, then there's no flights, and the ferry doesn't run if it's not safe to run the ferry. Now, in my book, this happens a little faster, maybe. Usually you would get a little bit more notice. But yes, absolutely, especially once the summer is over, you can be stranded there.
And your book is a book, and it needs to happen a little faster sometimes than real life.
We have, I'll tell you also, and I hope it doesn't ruin anyone's enjoyment, there is no deputy ambassador at the Canadian embassy because it's a small embassy. And again, I feel like the reader, I hope, is willing to suspend their disbelief in some circumstances.
I'm guessing 99% of people would not even question that. Or maybe it's just me. I don't know.
Well, there's always things like this that, and I did a little note at the end for diplomats who read it to say, look, I know that this doesn't exist. And it's the same thing. The person dies by poison. I don't know how many doctors I spoke to about poisons and research.
Don't talk about the poison because that makes me want to say something that.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. Let's not, because it'll be a spoiler. Okay. So one of the things. Well, you mentioned your note. I really love author notes and acknowledgments, and I loved yours as well.
Do you like the grammar on the first page about the Icelandic word? Because I thought if the reader is willing to read half a page on Icelandic grammar, then I feel like I've got them hooked into the book.
I appreciate. I was going to say the warning, but that sounds very American, to be warned of a language that I'm not familiar with. So, but I appreciated that heads up. One of the things I especially liked, and I am not a cook by any stretch, and so this I think speaks volumes. How much I appreciated that you acknowledged the chef's role in this big fancy dinner, and all of the stress, the likes, the dislikes, the allergies. Yeah. Like, where did that come from? Why did you include it?
The chef is an important character in the book. So, and he's one of my favorite characters. I really enjoyed writing him. And so I guess because the chef is a character, that's his profession. And so he's going to talk about that. And I think, as you know, the food plays an important role. And again, personally, I love food and I love eating. And Icelandic cuisine is actually really special and delicious, and maybe not something that people know a lot about. And so I wanted to write about that. And the restaurant Skell in the book, which the Skell is the Icelandic word for shell, and seafood, is based on a real restaurant that's on the Westman Islands. One of my favorite restaurants in the country, and they're closing after the end of this summer. So if you read it in the book and like it, you need to go this summer.
And she promises you won't die.
Yeah, exactly. And I know the chef quite well, the owner and chef of that restaurant. And so with his permission, some of the dishes that are described in the meal are actually based on real dishes at the restaurant. But the chef is not based on the real chef.
I looked up, again, not a chef, not a cook, not a baker, not a anything, but there was a reference a couple times to, I won't say it right, but it's an herb, angelic.
Angelica. Yeah.
Oh, it's like it's
Yeah,
spelled.
Angelica. Yeah, it's grown in the north, and it's got a very distinct anisey kind of flavor. And it's used a lot in Icelandic cooking. It grows in the north of Canada as well. And again, I wanted to talk about herbs that you find locally on the island, because in this restaurant as well, they do a lot of foraging. So they'll get local berries, local mushrooms, local herbs, and cook with those. And so I wanted to talk about that a bit. And so Angelica, you said it's now I've lived there for 20 years. To me, it's just it's a herb that it's just used all the time. Jane hates it in the book, but I quite like it.
That was good to put that in. Yeah.
Yeah. It has a distinctive flavor. I sent one to my editor because on Iceland Air, which I fly a lot when I'm traveling, of course, they have an Angelica infused gin. And I got a gin and tonic, and I sent the little photo to my editor, because the British editor, I don't think she knew of Angelica either. And I said, look, it's a thing, and I'm drinking one right now.
If it's in a drink, it's a thing for sure. Yeah. Oh, speaking of drinks, there is a drink in the book that's very key called the Flaming Viking.
Flaming Viking.
First, I want to know if it's real, and then explain like the role in the book, because it's important.
Yeah, it is. So it's not real, but it is now. So I wanted a drink, and it's important. You'll see in the first 20 pages why it's important. There's a big show about preparing this drink called the Flaming Viking, and I made it up. And made up the name. I wanted to make up a kind of touristy sounding, drink show that was for visitors, like important visitors, that you would do this big performance of it. And I wanted a drink that, that you could set on fire, and that sounded like it had, that was quite strong and had ingredients you got at the island. And I wrote it quite generically. And then I have a friend in Iceland who's a mixologist who offered to create a Flaming Viking cocktail. And so that was an excuse to just have a cocktail drinking evening. And so one evening, a few of us went over to his house, and we tried all these different cocktails. And then I got to pick the one that most closely resembled how I envisaged the Flaming Viking.
But if the Flaming Viking is even half as potent as it sounds like in the book, like how could you have even been standing to choose it?
Yeah, I picked the worst tasting, strongest one, because it is meant to be a really like touristy, kitschy thing. And this all happens in the first 20 pages, so we're not giving away too much. But they've had this long day. They've just found out that the weather has stopped everything. So Jane is particularly grumpy. They've had wine with dinner. And so people are like, let's set a cocktail on fire with all this drink. And people say, all right, I'm in. So that's what happens.
And it's really great. It made me think of like when she says for tourists and kind of kitschy or whatever, it made me think of like going to Vegas and seeing like something like that.
Yeah, it reminds me of another story. When my first book came out, I went on a book tour, and I went to Houston, and it was the first time I'd been to Houston in my life. And it was my birthday. And I thought, here I am alone in Houston on my birthday. And I did the book event. It was actually a lecture during the day. And I thought, it's my birthday. I'm in Houston. I'm going to go, and I'm going to have a steak and a glass of red wine because I deserve it. And I went into this restaurant that looked normal, and it was one of those like all you can eat Brazilian like meat buffets.
Yes.
I did not know that was a thing. And I'm going to tell you that it's not the best thing to do when you're alone. And because you feel like you want to, I don't know, maybe it's a Canadian thing, like I want to get my money's worth. So I'm not just going to have the one steak. I'm going to have like 7 steaks or something. And they bring it all, and it's on the sword. And, I think I gained like 10 pounds just sitting there that evening. It was a memorable birthday.
You did it right, I think. It's called All You Can Eat for a reason.
I obviously did not know. And I was too embarrassed. I walked in, and she's like, do you understand the concept here? And I was like, yeah, no problem. I was too scared to say, no, I'm going to go. But so I stayed and kept eating.
Now you can educate others.
Yes.
So you are familiar, obviously, with the islands and Iceland. So did you even have to do any research for writing?
I didn't do extra research. The history of the islands, as I said, we discussed that exhibition, which I kind of re-looked at online, but had seen numerous times. There's also a long story that is just very well known in Iceland about a volcanic eruption that took place there in 1973. Before, obviously, the technology... we still can't predict eruptions super accurately, but you can at least now see when there's lava accumulating under the surface somewhere, there's more earthquakes. But at the time, they didn't have that same technology. And Iceland's a volcanic island, so we do get regular volcanic eruptions, but there hadn't been one in this area for, since before the time of the settlement. And in the middle of the night in January in 1973, this fissure opened up outside the town and just started spouting lava and fire into the sky in the middle of the night. And they had to evacuate. The community was about 5,000 or 6,000 people at that time, and they had to obviously evacuate it in the middle of a winter's night in January. And it was a trauma on the community, of course, and they couldn't go back for many months. A third of the town was buried under lava, and a third of the town was destroyed by ash. A third of the town remained. Many people chose not to go back, but many people did go back and rebuild. And of course, that was in many people's living memory, right? So it's affected a lot the psyche of the community, and I wanted to explore that a little bit as well to see how it affected the memoir. But after I'd written it, I had a couple of locals, people I knew as well, read it over just to make sure that I hadn't made some mistake about that or the geography. There's also a scene that takes place in a swimming pool, and that's a very Icelandic thing. We have a lot of natural. I know that I'm sitting here in Scottsdale, which is super hot outside, and Iceland is not super hot, but we have a very strong swimming pool culture. We have a lot of natural geothermal hot water, and so it's very normal to go and sit outside in a hot tub whenever you want and watch the northern lights or have it snow on you. And so even in the bad weather, there's a scene in the swimming pool there because the Westman Islands have one of the best swimming pools in the country.
One other thing that I think that you did really well was include, the history and the setting without too much. Okay. And was that easy or hard, or did your editor help you out, or did you just naturally on your background know that's enough?
I think I just did it a little. I'm trying to remember now. I did a lot of travel writing, so I have a background in travel writing, and I love travel, and so that's an area that I've done quite a bit of writing about before. And I always, to me, that was always going to be a strong point of the book. Was Iceland is such a wonderful setting and wonderful location for this kind of a story that was always going to be something that I wanted to talk about and explain. And I'm sure that. Now I've forgotten it. There was plenty of rounds of edits with my editor. So I'm sure that they, if anything, they probably had me bring it out more than me cut back. But I think it was something that I always started with. And it was always appealing when I was selling the book to have it published, I think was something they were interested in.
What was the process like that was, doing crime fiction compared to your nonfiction? Were you prepared for the difference, or was it a smooth sailing, or what?
It's much harder, I think. I'm always curious to know what other people think who've written different things. I thought it was much harder, and I thought it would be easier somehow, maybe naively, because I thought, well, it's fiction, so I'll just take them in a different direction, or this won't happen if I don't want to write about it. But it's almost like if you're trying to move around a room and you've got walls and it's dark and you can feel the end and it makes you feel a little bit better when you have the walls, but with fiction you don't. You're just kind of floating in space. And so I found it a little bit more difficult. And I think in nonfiction too, they always say the truth is stranger than fiction. And if something happened and it's a fantastical, wonderful story and it happened, you can write about it. But when you're writing fiction, I felt I was constantly thinking, do people believe that this would really happen? How much is too much to have the reader believe? Because at the end of the day, it's a murder mystery. Iceland has 4 murders a year. So just the whole premise of the concept is going to be unrealistic. The reader knows that, but you want everything else to be reasonable, right? Not totally ridiculous. And so that was an interesting process of figuring out how much you want the reader to come along. And I had one of my editors is Nita Prose, who wrote The Maid, that's done really well in the murder world.
A little bit.
Yeah.
I think I've heard that name.
She's not working as an editor anymore. It's done that well. But she was wonderful too. And she said, again, like as long as you introduce realistic characters, the reader is generally willing to go along with you in terms of what happens to them. Yeah.
Very good advice, because it can be really difficult to write something that's interesting but believable, but not really believable because it's fiction and you can't please everyone, so you just got to do the best that you can.
I think that's the same with everything is, there's always going to be people who don't like it, and there's going to be people who don't like it and want to tell everybody else that they didn't like it, or that I'm sure there's something wrong in my book, factually wrong. I'm sure someone will want to tell me that too, but that's
I found
what can you do?
Absolutely nothing wrong with it. Thank you. Did you, the process of writing your first crime fiction novel, did you, you sold the book, did it change much from what your idea was when you sold it versus what it actually looks like today?
Yeah, it changed quite a bit actually. And I think the hardest thing was writing it all because, again, a difference between nonfiction and fiction. With nonfiction, you can sell the idea of a book and a book proposal. So when I had the idea for my nonfiction book, well, it was always more difficult than I thought. I was a bit naive and I thought, oh, I'm the first lady and everyone's going to want to publish my book and I'll write one paragraph and people will think great and it'll go to auction and, all that happened. None of that happened. But I did just have to do an outline and 2 chapters, and that was and then I'm contractually obligated to finish the darn book. But with fiction, you have to write the whole thing before you can sell it, and that's hard on your motivation. I mean, you will know this as well and can speak to it. That I kept thinking, well, what if I'm writing this? And even I had an agent, which is a huge advantage, of course, and she was very encouraging. And I thought, but she might send it out to 50 publishers, and they'll all say, thank you, but no thank you. Or, and then 50 more who'll all say, thank you, but no thank you. And then so I could write this whole book and nothing would come of it. And then I thought, but I know 100% that it will never be published if I don't write it. And that was kind of what motivated me to do it. And I was fortunate in that I ended up working with the same publishers, or at least in North America, the same publishers, people I'd worked with. And I think that was helpful because they'd worked with me before. They knew all those practical things. I'll hand back my edits on time. I can accept criticism and can implement changes. And so I think there were more changes. And maybe even if I hadn't written another book, they might not have bought it right away because I did change a lot. But that was interesting in the process. I guess the biggest one that I can talk about is that the book starts at this dinner party that ends with the flaming Viking, and someone dies, and that happens in the first 20 pages. But in the first draft, it started just at the day when they're starting this visit to the islands, and you work up through the day, and I thought there was all this tension and conflict, and then you end up at the dinner and someone dies. And Nita, very kindly, more delicately than I'm about to put it, said to me, no one's going to read until page 80 if nobody dies before page 80. And I was like, okay. And so I moved it around. And I think it was a good change. So I started, in the moment, I start with this dinner. You don't know who all the characters are, and there are a lot of them. So it takes a little while. And then this person dies, and then you turn the page, and the next chapter says, 13 hours before she dies. And it's kind of like a countdown clock to get back to the dinner, which you then see from a different point of view and learn something new.
And I really enjoyed that, that each chapter was how many hours left. How did that come about?
That was, again, because I'd moved it around. And after I moved that around, which I thought was a lot of rewriting, then my editor said, okay, that's great, but now the tension really deflates when you go back to the next. You think you've done the big change, and then you got to change it more. And I guess there were 2 things with that, which, again, they were absolutely right. Just I made text changes as well, but just adding this countdown clock, I think, reminds people we're working towards something. And I won't say more, but there's kind of more of a twist on that as well. And I think I realized they'd say, oh, this section is quite dull. We could maybe take it out. And I think, no, that's really important for this reason to do with the denouement and everything. And then I realized, of course, the reader doesn't know that when they're reading it in that moment. And maybe this is a basic thing, but I realized you kind of need to write 2 stories at once. You need to write the story that is going to be important for the end of the book and the denouement. And on top of that, you need to write an interesting story in the moment that will keep the reader interested as we're going through that and not notice any of the other stuff. So I had to do that too.
And clearly you succeeded because you have the sequel that you're working on.
I am, yes. The sequel, which I have 54,135 words on.
Congratulations. That's significant.
And of the first draft, which is that draft that I won't show to anyone, that is full of, a sentence and then add 2 sentences here and then other text, things like that. Those count towards the word count, absolutely. And it'll come out sometime soon. And then it's also been optioned for television.
I was just going to mention, hey, I heard. And what's so interesting is, first, I apologize. I did not put my phone up here because I didn't want it to vibrate or buzz or anything. So I don't know what the time is. So if anybody wants to give me a heads up.
It's 35 past, yeah.
I wanted to make sure we have time for questions.
Yeah.
So being optioned is a big deal, and you had to sit on this for a while. It
A
wasn't like
year, yeah. I
it
couldn't.
was just announced.
It was just announced right before the Canadian edition came out at the end of April, and yeah, I sold the rights like in February last year. So that was a long time to not be able to tell people, but also nice, flattering, that I was still editing the book after it had been sold. So it will be, and it's a long journey. It will be a Canadian Icelandic co-production to make a 6-part TV series. And the idea would be that that's based on this book. And then if the TV series does well, then the next season would be based on the next book. So the showrunner will have to expand some storylines, obviously, because you need kind of more material. But I'm excited to see how it's going to happen.
I'm excited to see the Flaming Viking.
I know. My kids think it's way cooler. They're like, Mom, you wrote a book, but TV series, that's amazing.
And you are also working on another book, a memoir.
Yes, I'm also writing a memoir of my time serving as First Lady of Iceland, which is a story that I hope is kind of informal and casual. And yes, it's the story of being a First Lady, but it's really about an ordinary person who ended up in an extraordinary role and how I tried to make the most of that unexpected opportunity. Because I think, as I mentioned before, it happened in 6 weeks when our kids were 2, 4, 6, and 8 years old. And was not something that we ever expected to have happen. So it'll come out next year.
It happened in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
How about that for a title?
Yeah, we're working on titles at the moment.
I like it happened in 6 weeks. Somebody write something that fits that, because I think that sounds great. Patrick popped out, so I wanted to just check. I don't know if you've looked online for any questions or if you want to check with the audience.
Actually, I've got a question from Stefania from Italy.
Stefania, hello.
So she is
Sam's a regular.
She's a regular. So we love
I'm waving to Stefania.
2 a.m. at the moment, so she's up early. She's really curious how you learned Icelandic and how did you end up becoming, how did you become the First Lady of Iceland?
That's a whole. I'll save that for. I'll tell that story too, but I'll use it also. It's in the book. How did I learn learning Icelandic? So I do speak Icelandic. I speak it pretty well, but I speak it with an accent, and I've made many, many mistakes in the language. It's a pretty complicated language because nobody moves to Iceland speaking Icelandic. I think it's safe to say, and so it goes in fits and starts. You just have to take a lot of lessons. And the hardest point I found, because people in Iceland speak excellent English overall, is when you've learned a little bit more than ordering food in a restaurant, but the person you're speaking to speaks better English than you do. And then you still have to continue in Icelandic to kind of work through that. And then you just learn different terms. When my kids started preschool, and I learned the terms dinosaur and snot. And these are words that you use all the time if you have preschool children, but you don't really use all that time otherwise. And then say your husband runs for public office and you learn words like candidate and referendum and constitutional amendment, and then things that you don't necessarily use all the time otherwise either. So it's an ongoing process. And then the story of becoming First Lady, which I'll try to do a kind of potted, unusual version. But yes, we've been living in Iceland. We met in the UK in graduate school, moved to Iceland in 2003, and just built this life for ourselves. My husband has a PhD in history and was working as a history professor at the University of Iceland. And his area of expertise is 20th century Icelandic political history and international relations. And I was editing Icelander's in-flight magazine, doing travel writing and that kind of thing. And we had 4 children together who were 2, 4, 6, and 8 years old. And in 2016, in early April, the Panama Papers scandal broke, which was the scandal to do with tax havens. There were world leaders who had funds that were being kept in tax havens. And in Iceland, we have a president who's more of a figurehead. It's not a political role. And we have a prime minister, and the prime minister belongs to a political party and kind of has the political role, runs the government. And our prime minister at the time was implicated in the Panama Papers scandal. So it was a huge breaking news story in Iceland. Ultimately, he ended up resigning as prime minister. And my husband, who was writing a book on the presidents of Iceland and new politics, was the pundit that they called on television to analyze the crisis, because it was just, the news just cut to the story because there was all these protests that happened all day. So they were covering it all day. So he was on the news for several hours. And there was a presidential election scheduled for that June. So this is April. The election was in June. And the outgoing president had announced he wasn't going to run again. And there were other people who'd announced, but nobody had really kind of fully captured the public's imagination, I think it's fair to say. And people saw my husband on television and thought, well, this guy seems to know a thing or two about the Constitution, and he's pretty smart and he's neutral, and maybe he should run. And they literally started calling our house to say, we saw you on TV and we think you should run, or sending him Facebook messages or text messages. And that was in early April, and the election was in June, and he won. And then he won again 4 years later with 92% of the vote. And so it really, really happened extremely quickly. And I could go into more detail, but that's the nutshell version of it.
That is fascinating, to say the least. As president, you said it's not a political role. Well, first, I'm blown away because you talked about protests and how it was in the news, and I'm like, so many things don't get covered here where we are. But again, let's not go into politics.
It was that story was on the cover of the New York Times, actually, so it was big enough that it was.
I remember the story, but yeah. Okay, moving on. Tell me about when that happened, because you said it's not a political role. So were you still like living in the same house and taking care of the kids,
so
or was it like
after he won, then we moved to a presidential residence, and there was a driver, and lots of different things. But I'll tell the difference is that we were thinking about it and thinking, okay, should he do this? Would he like to do this? Do you think he could do a good job and all of this? And we decided, let's take, as long as we wouldn't ruin our children. I think that was the biggest thing was how would it affect the kids, and would he would he like to do it and do a good job? And so we decided that, all right, he's going to go for it. And we thought we need a campaign poster, right? A little brochure or something for when he announces. And to have a family photo with the kids. And my husband also has a daughter from his first marriage. She was in her early 20s then. And this stylist calls the house. I always remember this. And I'm probably like changing a diaper, and like the kids are fighting in the corner, and there's like suppers boiling. What any kind of household with 4 young kids, right? And the stylist says, can you describe for me your personal style? Because they're going to bring some clothes, like this brochure. And I remember thinking, like, my maternity pants still fit very well. And I last bought shoes, 5 years ago. And there's just like silence on the other end of the line. Like, okay. And certainly the clothing side of it was a very steep learning curve for me. And yeah, I mean, there's lots of very fish out of water stories that I've written about in the memoir.
That we will read about.
You'll read about them in a memoir in a year.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Any questions here? Yes. Can you repeat the question for
the
online audience?
So the question is, how many words is the book, and did I write to that? And then how much did Iceland sort of play a role as a character? I think it's around 75,000 words. And there was a word count in the contract, but of course I'd written a draft. I didn't really have that in mind, but that's kind of how it ended up. I am not someone, there's lots of writers who write the first draft is 150,000 words and then they have to cut. And that was not me. I don't know why. It was just how it ended up. So, and I think that's probably around what the second book will be. That is kind of what a normal, 70 to 90,000 is about what publishers are looking for as well. And Iceland as a character, I wanted to have a strong sense of place in the book. I think that that's one of the unique selling points of the book. When I was selling it, that it's sort of, Agatha Christie style meets Nordic noir. And I love Iceland, and I've lived there for over 20 years. And so I really wanted to share some of what I love about the country with the reader. And I hope that comes through as well.
It absolutely did. I think, Patrick, do you have another question? I do have another question. Thank you.
I do have another question. So our online audience wants to know, first of all, what is an odd Icelandic tradition that you have now fully embraced? And for you and Christina, what is one odd writing tradition that you now embrace within your own writing and your kind of like
what
your
a super easy
habit?
question.
Is that Robin or Renee?
That's Renee.
That's a tough question, Renee, but I'm going to go for it. So, Icelandic traditions. This isn't odd, but this is something I kind of do now, and that is there's a lot of superstition in Iceland. I start my first nonfiction book about that, saying that in Iceland it's bad luck to begin a job on a Monday, which is true. And when I got my first job, they said, "No, come in on Tuesday. Don't start on Monday."
Let's start that here.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't start a big thing on a Monday. But the tradition that I've adopted a little bit is that there's a saying that if you have a guest into your home, if it's like an old friend and it's casual and you're sitting down, you have a cup of coffee and they're like, "Well, I got to go." And you say, "Right, see you, have a nice day." But in Iceland, if you don't walk your guest to the door, they leave with the soul of the house. And so you should always and sometimes if I'm a little bit lazy and it's an old friend who's just stopped by, and I'll say, like, "Don't leave the soul behind as you go out." Like, I'll just remind them not to bring it with them.
That doesn't apply to family members, does it?
No,
They
like
can go
everybody,
out?
you should go. Oh, not people who live in that house.
Okay.
No, but family members who visit you. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I am very stumped on Renee's question about odd writing traditions. So, do you have one?
I feel like you had the time I was answering this to think of your answer.
I did. I'm sorry. Oh my God.
It's so, these are the kind of questions too. I think I'm going to wake up now at 2 a.m. and be like, this is a brilliant answer. A weird tradition. I do like, okay, this is going to this is going to sound like a weird little tradition. So I hope it's a good answer.
We want odd.
Okay. So as this year, I've been writing 2 books essentially, right? I've been writing the second book in this series and I've been writing this memoir. And I've been alternating after I would do a section and then I would send it maybe to my editors or someone. And then when they're reviewing it, I'd be writing the other book. So I kind of alternate and go back and forth. And in Iceland, it's very dark in the winter, right? It's dark in December. The sun doesn't come up until almost 11 in the morning. And so and I write often in the mornings. And so you spend from about like October until March, you're at least getting up in the darkness and you're spending a lot of the time in the darkness. So you have a lot of candles, right? To keep the lights and keep it cozy inside. And I have 2 different scented candles that I really, really like. And when I was working on this book over the winter, when I was working on the murder mystery, I had 1 candle that I lit. And when I was working the other book, I had another candle. Because I kind of thought the different scents would sort of put me in the mindset of the other book.
Do you remember what the scents were
No.
or are?
No. People have gifted them to me, and I
okay.
just didn't.
Wasn't like one smelled like blood for the murder.
No.
Okay.
I do at December time. There's like a fir kind that smells like a Christmas tree. This wasn't one of them, but I like that because the hotel where I'm staying now has a soap that smells like that. It's really nice. It smells like sort of fir trees.
Many writers have like superstition or they have a routine that they need to get into as they write. And so your candles, unfortunately, mine is just like stress eating.
That sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah, that's not an odd tradition. It's an unhealthy, it's not a superstition. It's just no matter what, I'm like, I should be writing. Ooh, and I'm going to eat. Or edits are due, I'm going to eat. I did get a treadmill to try to balance that out, but it's kind of hard to write and walk slowly on the treadmill.
I know people who do that. Susan Orlean, the writer, said too, she walks like super slowly while she's writing.
I'm working on that, so maybe that will be my odd tradition. Thank you for asking, Renee. Any other questions in here? Yes. Of course.
Did you know you were going to do a series when you started this first book?
No.
The question?
Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Did I know I was going to do a series when I started this first book? Yes and no. I think I wrote it thinking, I didn't write it, it's not like a trilogy or has an open time. It's more the ideas that it could be a series. So if people really like it and I really like writing it and have more ideas, I can write loads of them. And that's the advantage of having diplomats is even if I got sick of Iceland, which I'm not yet, but if I wanted to change it, they can get posted somewhere else, So I did have that sort of in mind. And then when I sold the novel, it was a 2-book deal at least. So I knew at least that there would be one more. And that enabled me to go back in and kind of sew in maybe a few little conflicts that are unresolved that I can explore a little bit more in the next book.
It'll be interesting to see how Jane and her husband, how their relationship is handled in book 2.
Yes, we are working on that now. And there's a police officer who comes back because he was quite popular amongst the editors as well. So the police officer that you meet in this book will return.
The
Jonas.
younger
Yeah,
one.
Jonas or Jonas. Yep.
Yes, Erin's got a question.
Yeah, I was going to say, since you switched the format of it up, would you say it's a traditional mystery or is it more of a psychological, a suspense because you've
Yep.
switched it
question is it a traditional mystery or psychological suspense because I switched the format? No, I'd say it's more of a kind of classic golden age style book. You know, I loved Agatha Christie when I was young, and I wanted one of these books where it you kind of get this climactic moment at the end, and also where in theory you should be able to guess it from the beginning or not, so that it's not like the murder is an alien that comes in on page 200 or something. So yeah, I think it is more in that style, even though the time goes back a little bit.
But set contemporary, because sometimes when we hear golden age, we think set back decades
No,
ago.
set now.
but-
And I can also see that because, boy, the everything is a lot harder now, too, with all the technology. And that's why it's good to be stranded. It's harder to send, like, blood samples, and makes it a little bit easier to not worry about the technology side.
And how many bad people get caught because they had their cell phones with them, right? And cops were able to pinpoint where they were. And any other questions here? Yes, sir.
There's a question about was there something in my life that got me started as a writer? That's a lovely question. Thank you. I come from a storytelling family that loves storytelling. My father is an English literature professor. And so we had a lot of books and stories around. And my mother, who's a homemaker, I think I didn't appreciate this enough when I was growing up, but she's just the best storyteller of everyday stories. You know, and when we were kids, she, we'd say, "Oh, Mom, tell us the story about when you forgot to bring your sandwich to school, or when you put your dress on backwards," and we had all this sort of greatest hits of Mom's stories that, when you think about it, were just really kind of little vignettes and short things, but she could tell them as if there was a story with a beginning and a climax and a resolution and a protagonist, and so there was always a lot of storytelling. And I have two younger brothers. My youngest brother is also a writer named Eliza Reid, who's written a number of books as well, and some have been made into films. And he started publishing, long before I did. I never had an ambition to be a writer in particular, and I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. I mean, I love doing this, but I love doing lots of other things as well. And I think it's great that we're living in this day and age where you can kind of, if you're fortunate, you're able to sort of pick and choose a little bit and combine things. So, but I think I grew up without obviously consciously thinking about it like this, thinking about the value of storytelling for helping us to understand the world and to help us understand our place in the world, and to help us know that we all have something of value to contribute and that we all have stories to tell. And that's something that I try to work on a lot now when I do other talks. I also run a writers event every year in Iceland called the Iceland Writers Retreat, where people, again, who are interested in writing, they come to Iceland and they just meet other people who like to write, and they take different writing classes with people. And that's a lot of fun. And I've learned a lot from the people over the last 11 years who've come to take part in that event, just to know that we all have a story. And in Iceland, we have a saying in Iceland, "A ganga með bók í maganum," which means to walk with a book in your belly. And there's this idea that you don't like it, or you do like it. Someone's shaking your head. Okay, yeah, it's very kind of organic. I don't know. Just this idea that we're all waiting to have a story to give birth to, and I believe that, and I think more than ever, it's important to try to share those stories and to use these different stories to find out what connects us all. Because I think we're forgetting that. And I talked at the beginning about the importance of these person-to-person contacts, which I really believe in. But we don't all have the fortune of being able to have those person-to-person contacts. And storytelling is a way in which we can make those connections with us, whether that's fiction or nonfiction. So I certainly grew up learning the value of storytelling.
I love that. The story in your belly was a good one, Eliza.
Well, there's plenty of room in my belly, so there's lots of maybe lots of stories.
You got two more coming. Thank you all so very much. We really appreciate you coming. And the pen has signed copies, or if you want Eliza to personalize a copy, she is more than happy to do that here. And thank you, online audience, for joining us. We know Renee and Stefania was there, and I'm guessing Robin was.
Maybe my mom, who knows? She's always,
If
I don't
not,
know.
she can watch it anytime
There you go.
now.
That's it.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.